As to the Troubles themselves, it's all in the history books, and there's a timeline available on better websites such as the Kane website. Now, really the 1970s were the worst years, especially the early 1970s, and I think along with a lot of people, reconciled myself to cutting down but never fully eliminating the chances of being hurt or killed. Don't be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Don't be incompetent. A lot of early morning radio news shows would begin with the words, "A body was found." And if you were not in Crossmaglen or North Belfast or in a pub that exploded, because I don't drink, or if I would never have gone out in certain places after dark or joined any kind of organisation, then obviously the chances of something untoward happening were reduced considerably. The best history is probably the book Lost Lives. Excuse me, this book by David McKiffrick and others. The actual victims, the people who died, plus the timeline, that is the history. Arguably, it does not really need the interpretation of historians. I think that confuses more than it clarifies. In other words, when I went back to Queen's University in 2005, there were one or two modules which were about the Troubles, delivered by English guys in their 30s, and in one case by an American woman in her 30s. And to me, it didn't just seem right that they knew more about it than I did. The 1970s were violent, and by the latter end of the 1970s, the IRA was totally defeated. Death, prison, internment without trial had had an enormous effect, not least taking out the very public 1940s, 50s men with that whiff of cordite and replacing them with a newer, younger, more vicious element. Arguably that brigade, battalion, company structure of a freedom-fighting army was replaced by the secrecy of terrorist cells. And there was a nihilism, most obvious in the prison protests of hunger strikes, and perhaps more infamously the dirty protests of prisoners who demanded prisoner of war status by refusing to wear prison clothes, refusing to wash, and smearing the walls of their cells with their own excrement and menstrual blood. Arguably the war was being fought in the prisons, and I tend to look at the 1970s as my single years, lonely years of Simon and Garfunkel songs, and I tend to look in the 1980s as the married years. I started going out with my wife in 1981 at the height of the hunger strike. Bobby Sands was the first and the most famous death. He lived just 2 doors from my wife's family. 18 months after he died, his parents were at our wedding. Now, I don't say that in a kind of name-dropping kind of way to give the impression that I know famous people. Rather the opposite. I never even met Bobby Sands, but he was born into that same legacy that I was born into. Historical figures are, in Northern Ireland terms, extremely ordinary people. He made his choices, I made mine. But the hunger strikes had the effect of bringing the IRA through Sinn Féin into the political process, and certainly in the 1990s the choreography for setting up the peace process had already been in place. And eventually that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 under the chairmanship of your own Senator George Mitchell. That was torturous, even those final 48 hours when Bill Clinton was on the phone urging further compromises. But around 8:45 a.m. on Good Friday morning 1998, my wife and I were driving to work when the car radio announced that the agreement would be signed that afternoon. And we just looked at each other and we said, we have lived through it. Now when it started, I was 17, my wife was 11, and now we're 45 and 40. And a lot of people didn't live through it, not just the people in this book, but the vast numbers of men and women who died of natural causes without ever seeing the end game. And yet we are stuck in the end game. The key factors are a power-sharing executive between Unionists and Nationalists, and a complex structure revolving around the concept of creative ambiguity. In other words, wording deliberately obscure to deflect too much scrutiny. The agreement was endorsed by the people of Ireland. About 94% of the people in the Republic voted yes, and probably about the same number of nationalists in the north voted yes, although obviously their votes were counted in along with unionists. And the best guesstimate is that about 55% of unionists voted for the agreement, so they were less convinced of its value. Essentially, the agreement sets out to be two different things. Nationalists see it as a series of stepping stones towards a united Ireland. Unionists tend to see it as a set of obstacles towards a united Ireland. Now, it might be one, it might be the other, it might be neither, but it's not both. In other words, people were conned, or at least some people were conned. Now, rightly or wrongly, it's not worked out the plan. The plan was that moderate unionists and moderate nationalists would be in charge of a power-sharing executive, and the more extreme elements in unionism and nationalism would have minor roles. Now, as it turned out, these extremes worked on the notion that moderates were compromising too much with the folks on the other side, and now the irony is that the government is being led by extremists in coalition, and now, almost 15 years later, we are stuck with that. Okay?